Henry VII, the first of the Tudor monarchs. Well, first we have the Wars of the Roses at the, really, I suppose this could be considered the tail end of the Middle Ages in a way. And I'm going to take us back a little bit into the history of this to a very powerful king who lived in the 14th century, Edward III. Now, under his leadership, England became one of the most powerful countries in Europe. At this time, there was a sort of surge of influence which faded away after his death. Additionally, this man, Edward, had two sons who divided themselves into two branches of the royal family. So it was these two branches of the royal family. One branch descended from John of Gaunt, and the other descended from Edmund of York. And so what became known as the House of Lancaster was descended from John of Gaunt, and the House of York was from Edmund, descendants of Edmund, the other brother. Okay, so two different. Sorry, let me dim the lights a little bit because. What should we do there? Is that a bit too dark? Put on the back spotlights for you. How's that? Has everybody got enough light to see the prints as well as the screen? Yeah. If it's too dark, let me know. Okay, so that's the. Yep. There are more prints at the front here. If anybody else doesn't have prints, please come and get them. Okay, so these two warring factions, sporadically, not all the way through, but from time to time, fighting would break out, and so it was called the Wars of the Roses. There were several different periods when there was fighting going on, so it was wars rather than a single war. And Henry Tudor was basically of the House of Lancaster. And the last of the kings on the side of York was called Richard III, and we don't necessarily know what Richard was exactly like, but there was a sort of story put about by William Shakespeare, no less, including other historians of the time and writers of the time. Shakespeare wrote a play called Richard III, and in it, Richard is a very unpleasant person. Physically, he is unprepossessing. Let me just try to create the picture. He was a hunchback. Okay, he had a hunchback. Okay, Richard III was a hunchback. Well, actually, I think we're going to find later on that there is actually evidence that he was. To a certain extent, he had a hunched back. But the other side of him is more open to doubt. We don't really know if he did as Shakespeare suggests, and if he did as has been quite often repeated in historical accounts. We don't know if he really did put his two nephews to death, because that's what he's said to have done. Okay? He's famously portrayed as a hunchback who ordered the murder of his two nephews at the age of 12 and 9. Certainly they were locked up in the tower. Certainly they did disappear. Somebody must have whisked them away and presumably killed them. But whether it was Richard himself or whether Richard ordered it or whether he had nothing to do with it, well, that's something that historians are still debating. But if you can get into your head this image of this little hunchback guy who's looking for, you're not my nephew, are you? No. Would you like to be my nephew? You've got a good chance that I might kill you. Okay, that's the yeah. You wouldn't want to be my nephew. Definitely, a bad deal. Okay, there's certainly it's a very risky thing because it's quite likely that he did bring about the death of his. Yeah, Prince here. If you put one or two at the back of the class for anybody else who comes late. Great. So yeah, that's the story that's put about. Whether it's true or not, we don't necessarily know. Let's get that out. Okay then. So that's Richard III, the last of the Yorkists, and killed in battle at the Battle of Bosworth. And actually, yes, the reason that I say it's probably true that he was a hunchback was that his bones were apparently found on the site of an old church 3 years ago, 4 years ago now. And he did have a deformity of the spine. And probably it would have been his right shoulder that would have led to, that would have been deformed, that it would have been a sort of hump on his right shoulder here, rather than a hunch on his back. Okay, so yeah, they seem pretty sure that those are the bones of Richard III, and they were dug up, as I say, about 4 years ago. All right, there he is, as he was in life, and you can see again his shoulders, his right shoulder does seem to be slightly raised here, and his remains were found in a car park in Leicester, on the site of an old church. Okay, so Henry's reign, well, he turned out to be quite a clever politician, and the first thing he did was marry Richard's niece. You see, by killing the king, all that leads to, by killing Richard III, even if he was, as they say, unpopular, it's not entirely sure how popular or unpopular he was, but by killing the king, all that was really going to happen was that the Wars of the Roses would carry on. There'd be another Yorkist saying, I should be the next king, and Henry would be at risk of, being the next victim in a continuing battle for control between these two families. But to put an end to all of that, he married Richard's niece. In other words, the two families are now united through marriage. Okay? So I think I said last week that fighting wasn't the only way to gain political control. Very often marriage would work just as well or even better. And in this case, it put an end to the Wars of the Roses and to the Plantagenet dynasty. That kind of whole period was ended, and the House of York and the House of Lancaster, their sort of traditional enmity and warring was brought to an end through marriage to Richard's niece, Elizabeth. And it's sort of difficult to say exactly, this is the end of the Middle Ages. People just sort of wake up one morning and say, oh, the Middle Ages are over. No, of course, it's not like that. But if we want to say, well, what sorts of things mark the end of the Middle Ages, we can say, well, as we saw last week, those two languages, the language of the Normans, the Norman French, and the language of the Anglo-Saxons, those two languages were now growing together into one language. There would be different registers of the language. People who were lower class would use more Anglo-Saxon. People who were higher class would use vocabulary that was of French origin. Think about it. All those words that end in "-shon," education, communication, civilization, they're all French words, through Latin words through French. Okay? Most of the abstract concepts, most of the philosophical language, most of the technical language, those sorts of things, nearly all of them have come into English from French. Whereas the basic words for everyday things, all right, house, Hus, okay, it's Germanic, okay, pigs, cows, things that, animals that people looked after in the fields. Okay, those kinds of things, the sort of basic things of everyday workaday life. Those would be Anglo-Saxon. But those two languages were now together, and some people would use more of the French vocabulary because they were engaged in those high-level pursuits. Other people would use more Saxon vocabulary, but it was all one language. And the Normans were no longer a distinct identity. Nobody could say, I'm a Norman. Everybody had mixed in at some point. And so people could say, oh, my family goes back to 1066. Yes, okay, but there would be some of your ancestors would be Anglo-Saxon, some would be Norman. Pretty much everybody was mixed in by this stage. It was very difficult to point to a separate Norman cultural identity. The nobility had grown weak. This is a second point for the ending of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are characterized by a feudal system which is essentially pyramidic in structure. The elite are at the top. Okay, this is the feudal system. All right, a small elite controlling the rest of the people, who are basically kind of slaves or serfs, or well, they're in a kind of low-class position, and there was very little in between here. There would be some merchants, some traders, some people who practiced professions that required training and education. But during the Middle Ages, that was a fairly small social class. The early modern period, the Tudor period, is a period when you start to get a significant number of people who are in a kind of middle area here. All right, you start to get a more powerful middle class. And the people at the very bottom, who in the Middle Ages, they would be serfs, which was like a kind of slave, more or less. A serf was close to being a slave. They would no longer be serfs, but they would have greater freedom of movement, freedom of who they worked for, freedom to work for a different master, for example, freedom to move around the country in search of work and that sort of thing. The serfs were born with one master and died with one master. They didn't have any choice. Their entire life was to be under the control of a lord, one of the elite. So that's another thing that would characterize the ending of the Middle Ages. And finally, culture. The Middle Ages had a comparatively restricted culture, limited culture. Suddenly, there came in a tremendous flowering of culture that we call the Renaissance. Mostly came from Italy, partly from Italy, but it spread across Europe. People's tastes changed in music, in literature, in painting. There was a big development going on culturally, and England would be part of that. Not such a great and shining part of it as Italy or perhaps some other parts of Europe, but certainly part of it. Okay? In philosophy too, ideas were changing. Instead of being purely Christian in its thinking, Europe was developing something called humanism, which was a kind of softer, gentler approach to life on this planet, not quite so bare and strict as the pure Christian teaching. We'll take a look at those things in a little bit more detail, of course, later on in the course. Henry's rule. What kind of a ruler was he? What kinds of policies did he have? Well, he doesn't attract anything like as much attention as his son Henry VIII, of course, but he's, in his own way, quite an important figure. Obviously, he wanted to make sure that his power was going to be stable, and in addition to marrying Elizabeth, he also declared that he himself had been king from the day before the fighting against Richard. So even before Richard was killed, he had been king. So this is a sort of technical move, because technically anybody who had fought against him was fighting against the king, and therefore was potentially guilty of treason and could be put to death. Okay, but in practice, he didn't actually punish people, providing they said, no, well, we agree, even though we fought against you, we accept that you are the king. But he gave himself a sort of legally powerful position by making the rule, making the declaration that he had been king since before the actual killing of Richard. Internationally, he was good at helping England to develop the markets, trading particularly with France and the Netherlands. And the economy built up, and it was a peaceful time. He also collected taxes from his own people quite strictly. But because we're moving into a sort of market economy here, there are good reasons for people to keep the peace. As long as people are buying and selling things, they're not likely to start, if they're trading with each other, they're a lot less likely to start actually fighting with each other. Okay, you depend on them for your market. Okay, you're exchanging goods, so you tend not to make war with them. And although Scotland did not become part of the United Kingdom until much later on, Scotland became an ally. Scotland became positively related to England at this time through the marriage of his daughter, Margaret, to the King of Scotland. And we'll come back to that marriage as well, because that marriage has huge consequences all through the 16th, all through the 16th century. His eldest son is called Arthur, and he marries the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. But as we shall see, he doesn't have the chance to enjoy his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, because he's going to die. Arthur does not live to become king. So we've got these two important alliances, one with Scotland and one with Spain, both achieved through marriage. Okay, so he really has a big impact on the history through these policies, particularly these two marriages, which have very profound effects. And what did he leave behind him? Well, firstly, because he was so good with all this trading and collecting taxes and managing everything, he had a large personal fortune. He died rich. As I say, Arthur died, and Henry, the next son, became king, and he's of course the very famous one that we all remember, Henry VIII, and we'll spend time looking at him over the next couple of weeks. He managed to waste or squander his father's money pretty quickly. And he also managed to weaken the economy. We remember Henry VIII much more than Henry VII, but in some ways he was the lesser man. He wasn't able to look after money the way his father was, and he wasn't able to help the economy. A big part of the reason being because he enjoyed fighting wars in Europe, trying to extend control over parts of Europe. So those two marriages had really important consequences. The fact that Margaret, the daughter, had married James IV, the King of Scotland, well, that meant that the Stuarts had a claim to the English throne. And later on, of course, we're going to have the Stuart period. So the Stuart period takes its beginnings from the fact that Henry VII's daughter married the King of Scotland. Okay? And then 100 years later or so, when Queen Elizabeth, the last of the Tudors, when she dies with no children, well then it's Scotland and the King of Scotland who steps in. So the 16th century is dominated by the Tudors, who are originally a Welsh family. The 17th century, the 17th century is dominated by the Stuarts, who are originally a Scottish family. So we can see that Wales and Scotland's relationship to England is kind of softened by the fact that the king or queen is in the 16th century of Welsh origin and in the 17th century of Scottish origin. This certainly helps to bring the countries together. So yeah, Arthur marries Catherine of Aragon, but just a few months later, she is left widowed. Arthur dies. And, it's a little bit badly expressed there to say that after Henry VII's death in 1509, she married his second son, Henry. Well, no, it was some years later, after Arthur's death, that she actually married Henry, because the father, Henry VII, was against the marriage, and it was only after the father died, after Henry VII died, that Henry VIII was actually able to go ahead and marry Catherine, and they had a child, Mary, who went on herself to become queen. She's the next, or she's the third of the Tudor, the fourth of the Tudor monarchs, and I'll be talking about her later on in the course. So that's his legacy, that's what he left behind him.